Um, I guess one of the questions too is I kind of want to get this out of the way too. Dominic, you sort of made a couple of correlations between the Outer Limits and the Twilight Zone, which obviously the Twilight Zone came a bit earlier, but they're often compared to each other. And I think that some comparisons are pretty fair. I know that a lot of the fans for the Outer Limits often felt that the Outer Limits did tend to have a bit more of an optimistic resolution to some of the stories. Tinkering with death, time, energy itself, technology, etc. But I think one could definitely get the impression as well that your dad Joseph didn't exactly hold his faith in really high regard when it came to technology. Um, being an important part in developing society, but at the same time, by contrast, it was very interesting because he really seemed to have a very high regard in uh, his faith in humanity, as a whole. He felt that was always present. What are your thoughts, as far as that impression goes, and the messages that your dad may have had for us to ponder after each of the episodes?
Well, I think the Twilight Zone was very much its own being, its own entity. It was a great show, and I love the Twilight Zone. And so it's done in a different style. It's done obviously by different people who had different mindsets, and it's done with a different philosophy. The Outer Limits
Yeah,
is really it's Greek tragedy and Gothic horror.
yeah,
Because my father was not fundamentally a science fiction fan. So he used the cape of science fiction to tell the type of human dynamic stories that were on his mind in regards to the time. So the Outer Limits is very, very much the mind of my father. And that's what you're seeing there. And so if you notice with the second season of The Outer Limits, where we had stories by Harlan Ellison, like Demon with the Glass Hand, that season became a lot more sci-fi driven. So therein lies the transition. The first season really was my dad. The second season was much more Leslie Stevens, because Leslie Stevens was a hardcore sci-fi guy. So if you look at the very first episode of The Outer Limits, the galaxy being on the first season, that's Leslie. That's totally Leslie. So that's where all that lays.